I'm just very annoyed at my profession, to be honest, although there are lots of honorable exceptions. But, I went into philosophy thinking that here was an arena where we could slug it out conversationally. And I know philosophers who will argue with me about literally anything. I used to be Facebook friends with lots of philosophers, not so much anymore, but, I used to be friends with them, and I'd see them arguing about tiny, tiny matters that no one gives a toss about out in the world. And then this comes along, this big issue about identity and politics and policies and, and they suddenly just go deathly quiet.
Welcome to the Unspeakable Podcast. I'm your host, Meghandaum. My guest, Kathleenstock, is a professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex in England. For most of her career, Kathleen was known primarily as a scholar on philosophical questions related to fiction and the concept of imagination. But in 2018, she began to speak and write about the issue of gender identity, specifically why her colleagues in philosophy were so reluctant to discuss something so seemingly ripe for the kind of inquiry philosophers live for. The backlash came swiftly, but so did tacit messages of support. And over time, Kathleen has become a leading voice on gender identity theory, policy reform, and their effects on women and girls. She spoke with me about this unexpected turn and the tension between recognizing the rights of transgender people and recognizing material facts. Perhaps most usefully of all, she explains the difference between sex and gender, which, admit it, you still may be confused about. A few quick notes about this episode. First, as with the last few, there is a brief message from the new productivity platform, The Process, about halfway through. For ad-free versions of this podcast, you can subscribe at patreon.com/theunspeakable. Also, at one point in the conversation, I refer to a recent guest I had on talking about the Academic Freedom Alliance, or AFA. I mistakenly call it the Academic Freedom Association. It's the Academic Freedom Alliance. Anyway, here's my conversation with Kathleenstock. Kathleenstock, welcome to the podcast.
Hi.
You are a philosopher. You teach philosophy at the University of Sussex. You write in your book that for most of your career, you have focused on questions having to do with fiction and imagination. You're not a culture warrior. You're not someone who's made a career out of making purposely polarizing statements. Yet you've become a voice in this incredibly contentious debate having to do with gender identity. And by definition, you've become controversial. How did you find yourself in this space? What drew you to it?
Well, I am gay, and so I have. I came out relatively late in life, and I immediately became aware of a whole set of issues around lesbian rights, I suppose you'd say, and I'd say lesbian identity, but I don't mean that in a trivial way. So I became aware of that. I've always thought of myself as a feminist, and I grew up in the 80s, or the 70s and 80s. And so my first exposure to feminism was around the late 80s, early 90s. I suppose when the seeds were being sown for the controversies we now see. But I really thought I understood that sex, as in biological sex, was important in determining social outcomes. And I didn't think that could possibly be in dispute, but then in fact we see that now it is. So I suppose when I first became aware of this as a controversy, I knew something was up. I knew that sex was important and we needed to be able to talk about it properly if we were feminists.
So when did you start sort of taking this on as an academic? What was the first thing you wrote or said that kind of sparked your interest, or other people's interest in what you were saying?
I mean, I lay low for a while, just sort of watching the emerging controversy, because in the UK, in 2018, I think it's hard to remember now, 2018, there was a public consultation the government did one on gender recognition, what they called gender recognition reform. So it's important to realize, I think, especially for US listeners looking on to the UK situation, in the UK, we have laws protecting gender reassignment and laws protecting sex, biological sex. And the controversy is not about whether we should roll back protections for gender reassignment at all. The controversy emerged when trans activists started arguing that the laws protecting gender reassignment should be changed to protect something called gender identity, which was a kind of inner feeling. So the government was publicly consulting on that kind of change and a few others as well. And I was struck by the fact that academics were either being wildly enthusiastic about the changes or nothing. There seemed to be nobody making the case that there was a clash of rights involved as soon as you move to talking about gender identity for women. So I wrote this, I eventually plucked up the courage to write a blog post on Medium, which is like a free blog platform. I'm sure you know about it. Anyway, I pressed send. It was something like, why are academic philosophers so quiet about gender recognition reform? What explains this? Because it looks on the face of it like a big philosophical issue, one that people would be keen to get their teeth into. Lots of conceptual distinctions and metaphysical aspects to it, as well as real life practical import. So I wrote this thing and immediately got very strong reactions, both positive from some groups and very negative from others. So then I was sort of in.
And the negative reaction was from academics primarily?
Initially, yes. I mean, it took a while to sort of filter out into the wider public. But yes, almost immediately. In fact, within 30 seconds of pressing send, I got very aggressive responses from some people that had followed me on Twitter up until that point, and obviously thought that I was
they're on the edge of their seat waiting for you to post something on Medium.
I think people just assume that people think like you, don't they? And then suddenly I press this send button, and they realize that they.
Or they have probably, maybe they have notification alerts. Like if the word gender pops up in something, they'll see it.
Or maybe they never have Twitter.
Sends it to them. Yes, yeah.
Yeah,
so was it like the only people that were saying this kind of thing were sort of conservatives, or what we would in America would think of people on the right wingers? Like, was it just saying the kind of thing that you were?
No. I mean, exactly. So, I mean, in the UK, this is what's interesting, I think, about it, is that there's a long tradition on the left of talking about sex-based rights. So the left is split on this issue, but the people that I was immediately inspired by were left-wing trade union activists organizing at grassroots level, or setting up organizations like one called A Woman's Place UK, another one's called Fair Play for Women. So these are traditional Labour voters, actually very involved, some of them in Labour politics. And that's where I'm coming from. I mean, I want to clarify, I haven't been massively involved in Labour politics in my life, but I've always voted on the left and thought of myself as on the left. So it's an unfortunate polarizing perspective to think that as soon as you are against gender identity, I mean, not in the sense of being against people with gender identity disorders, but against it as the political protection of gender identity, that you must be a conservative or on the right. It just doesn't go like that, because when people have the consequences spelled out to them for women, then that affects people from all different perspectives, I think, equally.
Yeah, I want to talk about the practical implications of this and the different examples that you give. But before we do that, the book is a very thorough and rigorous endeavor in explaining the difference between sex and gender. Mm-hmm. But I think for all the current discussion around gender, the way that word now permeates the discourse, including in pop culture, a lot of people, some very smart people, don't understand the difference between sex and gender. So the shorthand explanation I've always relied on is that sex refers to biological sex and gender refers to the performance of one biological sex or the other. What's missing in that explanation?
Well, what's missing is ambiguity that has to be recognized so gender actually is used in at least 4 different ways, and they're not equivalent. So that you've just named one of them, but equally for some people, and actually historically, gender was a kind of polite word for sex.
Right.
So quite often, especially the older generation, use the word gender, or they say, what gender should you have on your passport, or
because they didn't want to say sex,
yeah,
because
they
it was
didn't
like
want
a
to
dirty
say
word.
sex. So one of the fundamental problems with this is that the word sex, biological sex, is the same word as the word for the act,
Right.
and that has caused problems in itself, because it makes people seek a different word for biological sex.
Right.
And then they went for gender. I mean, in the 19th century literature, gender was being used as a synonym for sex. So that's one use. Then there's the sort of 70s, 80s radical feminist, or just feminist use, where sex is the social, gender is the social meaning of sex.
Okay.
So the stereotypes around sex, things like the norms, the expectations, what you might call masculinity or femininity, if you thought that those things were just socially produced, and they can vary from culture to culture. So what counts as feminine for one culture can be quite different from what counts as feminine for a different culture or a different historical period. So that's gender. So when feminists in the 70s used to say there's a difference between sex and gender, they meant there's a difference between biology and then how biology is socially interpreted, or kind of developed or performed, as you say.
Mm-hmm.
And that's leaving aside any big, there's a sort of separate culture war issue bubbling away, which I'm just leaving aside, which is whether this stuff, gender, is actually social or is it somehow biological. But let's leave that aside. So let's assume a lot of
maybe
it
work
is
up to
social.
that.
Yeah.
Okay.
But a lot of it is social, let's just say. And that's gender 2, let's say. So we had gender 1, now we've got gender 2.
Okay.
And then there's a third one, which is sort of, I think, relatively limited to universities, where people talk about gender as womanhood or manhood in a way that comes apart from biology. So I'm not, I can talk more about that one if you want, but I think actually that's not that common in the wider population. But what has become much more common recently is the idea of gender identity. And that's the fourth meaning of gender. And gender identity is supposed to be a feeling or an inner sense or an inner perception you have of your sex that is nonetheless detached from the actual facts about your sex. So an inner feeling of being female, even if, in inverted commas, outwardly you are male, or vice versa, or maybe even a feeling of being neither male nor female, or being both. And then in that case, you would be non-binary. Your gender identity would be non-binary, but it's psychological, not biological. And it's not necessarily to do with performance, because they tell us gender identity can be completely unexpressed. You know, it can be secret and inner. And maybe you haven't come out about your gender identity yet, but it's still something you have.
Or even unconscious? Do they think it can be like in your
to be honest, I'm
subconscious?
not sure about that.
I don't mean to throw a wrench in things. Okay.
You can say anything about gender identity pretty much, because it's
Okay.
precisely invisible.
Right.
And people do, so the claims about gender identity are getting more and more Byzantine and wild. Now, there are thousands of gender identities, and you can have pangender, and you can have demi-fluid genders and all sorts. But that they're talking about identities, and that's not the same as performance or expression. And it's not the same as the social meaning, because of course you can't identify into a social meaning. It's kind of imposed upon you. And it's not the same as biology. So when people talk about gender now, who knows? Two people could be arguing furiously about gender, and one of them could mean one thing and one of them could mean another thing. So that's part of our problem.
Let's talk about why this matters for a little bit here. So I think that people think about, like in the US, we have all these bathroom bills, so to speak, and it's a little confusing because it varies state to state, and it kind of like it's hard to kind of enforce, and it's hard to figure out what they mean. And the fact is that there have been transgender people forever. and they've been using the bathrooms, and it really hasn't been an issue. And so I think people sometimes think, well, who cares about that? Why are we obsessing about something like that? But then there's much more than that. There's, women's spaces, women's sports. So talk about like why you think this matters on a practical level.
Well, I think as the Americans say, I believe you say, the rubber really hits the road when you move to gender identity, right? So you're right. Trans people have been using, so trans women have been using women's bathrooms unproblematically for years, and of course that would be expected because transsexuals often are very, they're sort of they pass in inverted commas, so they look exactly like females. So there's no reason for them not to use those spaces. But the problem emerges when the idea is that you're really a woman because of how you feel, and this gives you a right to enter any female space. Now that's a problem because it interrupts the social norm. This is what I think anyway. I think this severely interrupts the social norm. The social norm used to say that if someone who was very male presenting came into your changing room or your shower or in a public space or any other place where women are getting undressed or asleep, if there's hostels, dormitories, if someone male presenting came in, you could say, I'm sorry, I think you're in the wrong place, or you could call someone, or you could, there's a kind of presumption that they shouldn't be there, not because you think automatically that they have ill intent, but you don't know. And as a woman, you are on average weaker and more vulnerable to sexual assault than males are. And your main predator is males. So it was a kind of social norm that protected women. And when you move to explicitly building into policies, public policies governing public space, that anyone who feels like, who has an inner feeling of being a woman is legitimately in that space, effectively, you've just made all those spaces unisex immediately, because now anyone can walk in and the woman in there cannot say, I'm sorry, I think you might be in the wrong place. Now, I know from long discussion of this that an immediate objection there is, okay, but what about women who present in a masculine way? They shouldn't be challenged going into female spaces. Shouldn't we have policies that work for them? And I think, yes, absolutely we should. So ideally, we'd have a range of different kinds of space for people to go where they felt comfortable, and it wouldn't just be a choice of one or the other. But I generally think that the main problem in this area is sexual violence against women. It's anyone who works in the area of sexual violence knows that predators will seek opportunities to predate. And I just don't see why public bodies would go out of their way to undermine one of the only protections that women had in this area, where in contexts where they're getting undressed or asleep, if they're in a hostel or a dormitory or something like that. And then there's also the problem of prisons, which is a huge extra complication to this issue.
And do we have statistics as to how prevalent these sorts of crimes are? Because I think it's easy for people to say, well, how often does this really happen?
Well, in Britain we don't, but I can tell you why we don't. Because we also have in Britain policies which say that when a person with a male with a female gender identity commits a crime, it's recorded as a female crime. So, this is in the UK, we have these policies everywhere in almost every area of public life, which is part of the reason that I felt like I have to come out and start arguing about this, because so we really don't know what the problem is. We do know, though, that sexual assault is underreported anyway. We do know that there would be massive stigma attached to reporting this, potentially in some subcultures. We also know that there are plenty of examples of peeping toms. So remember, we're not just talking about sexual assault. We're talking about voyeurism, what I would call flashing. I don't know what you call that. exposure,
no,
maybe.
yes,
flashing
with the raincoat. When the raincoat,
yeah,
when
with a
you get
raincoat,
up
or
and,
maybe in the
yes,
in the bathroom.
yeah,
There's also
yeah.
camera crimes increasingly because of mobile phone technology. There's upskirting. There's a whole range of issues, and you've got to remember that this is in no sense the claim that trans women are particularly a dangerous population. I have no evidence for that at all. But what there is no evidence for is that they are a less dangerous population than the male population, generally speaking. And that's what we'd be looking for. And I don't know of any evidence that shows that.
So, have you been tarred as a transphobe? It's very difficult to talk about this stuff with any degree of nuance. Like, how
Yes.
have you sort of navigated this territory as you speak out about this?
Well, yes, I'm absolutely tarred as a transphobe. I am not a transphobe, and I just think people are going to have to take my word for that. But I have very good relationships with trans people. I have some trans comrades who agree with me on these issues and who stand beside me to argue about them. And I also meet trans people in my professional life relatively often. So although I am not a transphobe, it is frequently said of me I am, because it is now, I mean, it's a genius move in a way on behalf of campaigning groups. They have equated any criticism of the idea that gender identity is more important than biological sex with transphobia.
Yeah.
So it's not really surprising that I then come out as a transphobe on that analysis, because I am definitely criticizing the idea that an inner feeling is more important than a material fact.
Yeah, yeah. So, with respect to the inner feeling,
Mm-hmm.
you distill the current iteration of gender identity theory down to 8 moments. I thought this was really interesting the way you do this. And you beginning with Simone de Beauvoir's The Second Sex in 1949,
Mm-hmm.
and ending with the explosion of identities we've seen, like literally in the last 2 years, maybe the last year even. I mean, it's
It's
like
changing all the time.
very much on the move.
Yeah.
So before we go down the list, I was particularly interested in what you identify as the second moment, and that was involving John Money and
Mm-hmm.
Robert Stoller. John Money was
Mm-hmm.
um, a, a child psychologist from New Zealand, and uh, I was really surprised that it was him who introduced this concept of gender identity. He perpetuated what has to be the most egregious violations of the Hippocratic Oath in modern medical history. But tell us who he is and what he was trying to get across.
Well, yes. I mean, he worked with what would then be called intersex children and adults, and now the terminology I use in the book is people with differences of sexual development. Sometimes it's disorders of sexual development. I think that terminology is in flux also, but let's say people with DSDs. So that is people who have variations in their sexual organs or in their hormonal ranges due to underlying disorders. So he worked with children that way, and he and other people like Robert Stoller. But this terminology emerged. This is in the 60s of something which they would call a gender role, which was the outward presentation of, I guess, femininity or masculinity. They didn't really, as far as I can see, they didn't labor its social aspect very much. They weren't really that interested in where it came from, but they would say, there's a way of behaving that's like behaving like a woman, or there's a way of behaving that's behaving like a man, and that's your gender role. And then gender identity is the kind of inner, they thought was the inner aspect of the outward role. So thinking of yourself as a woman, relating to yourself as a woman, whatever that really means. And the concept got purchase in talking about children with particular DSDs. For instance, somebody with complete androgen insensitivity syndrome is genetically male. They've got XY chromosomes, but they have their outer body, as it were, is female-like. So they have breasts. Sometimes they have vulva. So their outer external genitalia is female-like, but they also have undescended testicles.
They would be assigned female at birth as the...
Well, that's an example where the language of assignation makes more sense. Right. But yeah, they would be often this. I believe that this condition doesn't emerge sometimes till puberty, because at that point they don't have periods. But so it definitely could go undetected, and so that would be someone in Money's way of looking at it, somebody who had that. I suppose there's two different cases, one where they knew they had it and one where they didn't. If they didn't, they would have a kind of gender role that was feminine, and then they would have a female gender identity. Now, that kind of conceptual way of, this conceptual framework then started to be used for people who didn't have DSDs, who are chromosomally standard issue, as it were, and those bodies are standard issue, male or female, but who felt very strongly that they were somehow in the wrong body. And that would be people with what we would say who had gender dysphoria. But they're not people who have differences of sexual development.
Okay, but Money is associated with this infamous case of David, right? David Reimer, who was an male infant who had a botched circumcision and did not have a penis. And it was, correct me if I'm not remembering this right, but it was Money who said, "Oh, well, we'll just raise him as a girl. This is the solution to this." Is that a reductive version of the story?
I believe so. I mean, I'm not a historian, so I don't want to say anything too emphatic about that story, but that's the story I have read, that he encouraged the parents to treat the boy as a girl and to give him a different name, and then later on in life, the young adult David I don't know what to say, reverted, but basically renounced the female gender role that had been imposed.
Well, he kind of found out. I mean, I'm not even sure that he was told about it as a child.
Right.
I mean, and it was so, but I mean, I don't know, maybe you don't know the details, but was Money his physician somehow? Or I don't know how he came onto the scene. But it was, I mean, it's remarkable because it was decided, and this was in the 60s, that, oh, okay, no problem, just raise him as a girl. And I don't know if he was given, I assume he was given hormones. I'm pretty sure.
I assume so too. So, I mean, what I think is absolutely fascinating about that case is the way that so your reaction there was very strongly disapproving of it, and mine is too. Okay. But then I do think we need to ask then, what are we doing now in the case of some parents who are saying things like, my 3-year-old has a non-aligned gender identity. My 3-year-old assigned male at birth is really a girl. I mean, I just don't know what the difference is. Or I mean, especially if you're sending that child on a route that will end up with lifelong drug ingestion and irreversible changes to their body. So that's an interesting parallel to explore, I think, for ethicists.
Well, and in this case, I think the child was, they were raising the child as a girl, but he was still like peeing standing up. Like he had all these sort of, stereotypically male instincts behaviorally and otherwise. And I mean, he ended up committing suicide. I think he did marry eventually. But it's a horrific story.
It's a tragic story.
And, I'm sure I don't know if it quite, tracks with this now phenomenon we have with these small children saying that they are a different sex. I mean, the 3-year-old saying that he's a different sex is different than the 15-year-old, who is announcing a new identity in sort of a sudden way? I mean, this phenomenon of rapid onset gender dysphoria. I mean, maybe perhaps you
I'm not sure
disagree.
it's that different.
Okay.
I mean, well, the 3-year-old seems like
but the 3-year-old
even
is not on social media,
no,
getting
but
the idea that this is
learning. The 3-year-old, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt, but the 3-year-old is learning about the world. So the 3-year-old's concepts are not yet secure. They are learning what boys and girls are. They can easily get that wrong. There's absolutely no reason to think that they know what they're talking about. I mean, children identify as all sorts of things throughout a normal, healthy development, and they should be allowed to get on with it. But that's not what we're seeing. We're not just seeing sort of a relaxed, healthy tolerance for children's flights of imagination. We're seeing parents taking certain claims that very young children are making absolutely literally, and then telling everyone else that they're true, reinforcing the child's belief that they're true, and not leaving any other narratives open to that child. And parents and teachers are going along with it too. So that's completely different to a kind of healthy tolerance for whatever your child's come up with today.
That's a social phenomenon that I want to talk with you about in a little bit here. But just I think people are still. I want to make sure people understand this as much as possible. Sure. The third moment you talk about is Anne Fausto Sterling, the researcher, talking about biological sex continuum, and this folds into the intersex question here. I remember seeing her speak at a university a couple of years ago, and if I'm remembering correctly, she was making the argument that, well, because these sorts of I don't know if abnormalities or just variations are so common, then this really isn't a big deal. I mean, a lot of people are intersex, and there's some sort of like improbably high, like 2% of the population
1.7.
It's 1.7, right? Is actually technically intersex. So what's the big deal? And I remember she was speaking to like primarily undergraduates at a big public university here, and they were kind of like mesmerized and like, oh, well, okay. And right. Now that you mention it. So it just seemed to me really she was leaving out a lot of details there.
Well, yes. I mean, 1.7% of the population is not intersex if we're going to retain any meaning for that term. I mean, 1.7% of the population doesn't even, I would say, have significant variation. So what that includes, that number that she uses and others now use as well, is a condition called non-classical congenital adrenal hyperplasia. I think I pronounced that rightly. So that's a condition that emerges for girls, and I say girls advisedly, like females in, I mean, I'm not a medic, so I'm going to have to take the advisory that, medics could get in and disagree with me, but I believe it comes on late in puberty or at least manifests there, and is compatible with carrying a baby to term. So there's no big variation here at all. And that takes a huge chunk of that 1.7% away. So the conditions that we're most likely to think of as intersex, like genuinely intersex, are ones where there's ambiguity, and the doctor really has to do some tests to work out whether we've got female or male, or that there's, really quite pronounced variation in the body produced. So that it for instance, in the one I mentioned earlier, androgen sensitivity syndrome, where male bodies present in a female way, and then there's classical congenital adrenal hyperplasia, where the female body is virilized to produce genitalia that can look very like a penis and scrotum. So those are different to having something that's compatible with carrying a baby to term, and your body, your genitalia are absolutely normal.
Okay,
standard
so
looking.
that's what you just described would be what we would think of as a hermaphrodite, what we have historically defined as such.
I don't. Historically, perhaps, yes. I mean, I don't think there is such a thing as a hermaphrodite. There are, I think what this what if treated properly, the issue of people with DSDs like this does pose questions, which Fausto Sterling is asking about how to categorize them in a way that meets their interests, because they have interests. Obviously, they are often, it's a traumatic condition to have, and it's difficult for their self-perceptions, and often they are subject to invasive surgeries that are non-consensual or that are traumatic in other ways. So I'm not underestimating in any way the challenges faced by people with DSDs, especially ones which have some degree of sexual ambiguity about them. But the thing is that they're very, very small in number. And this kind of, the one I'm talking about, there's other kinds too, where you've got some cells in your body which express XX and some cells which express XY, for instance. So, or there's ovotesticular disorder where you've got some ovarian material in your body and some testicular material in your body. So these are really complicated cases, and I'm not a physician. So I wouldn't start to talk about how best to treat them. But to make those very small number of cases somehow central to our discussion of gender identity, when 99.9% of trans people are chromosomally standard, hormonally standard, and have morphology that's standard for their sex, is kind of, I just think it's inappropriate. And it's instrumentalizing people with DSDs for political purposes, which I also object to.
Right. Although it does come up in arguments, for instance, about competitive sports. You have figures like Caster Semenya, who's the runner. I can't remember which African country she is from.
She's South Africa.
She's South African. So she was competing as a woman. Always, she identified as a woman, but it was so extraordinary as a runner and beating all the runners. And I guess, I don't know if it was an Olympic, she was denied the ability to compete because they actually ended up sort of testing her, doing blood work and giving her all sorts of tests. And she was really sort of genuinely intersex. Is that right?
Yeah. I mean, I don't think it's officially known what variation she has, but look, that's a huge ethical issue, but it's a different ethical issue because it involves something that happened to her from birth onwards. And remember that what I've been talking about up until now, and what I talk about for most of the book, is a feeling. It's nothing. Yeah. It's not even the administration artificially of hormones. It's not the artificial suppression of testosterone. It's not removing testicular material through surgery. It's a feeling. So I think there's a huge temptation, or is it a strategy on behalf of political groups, in favor of transactivism, to smush all these things together, intersex people, Caster Semenya, whatever works to confuse people, to say there's just all this confusion and ambiguity here, so maybe we should just give them all a free pass. But they're not all the same. These cases are not all the same. And it's doing a disservice to people like Caster Semenya. And I'm not underestimating the thorny issues there, but they are different issues to the issues of a trans-identified athlete in Connecticut who, is absolutely standard male issue, but says, I've got a female gender identity, I'm now going to compete on the women's team. That's just a completely different issue.
Okay, speaking of confusion, Judith Butler. Let's talk about Judith Butler.
Okay.
She's your fourth moment. So I think you and I are around the same age. So when we were sort of coming up, Judith Butler was the North Star for a lot of people. Yep. You have the way you write about her is quite delightful. You have a line here. You say, Butler's worldview is hugely seductive. For those of a certain mindset, Butler is the Harry Potter of philosophy, transforming boring old truisms about the material world into something alchemical, shifting, and sexily impermanent. Okay, So tell us who she is and why she matters so much to a certain set of people.
Well, she's a professor of comparative literature at Berkeley. I always mispronounce that. Is it Berkeley?
Yeah, she's at UC Berkeley these days. Yeah. Okay.
Yeah. Well, I think she is. I don't know for sure. I haven't checked. People move around, but she's been there for a while. She was there for a while, and she is. She wrote a book in 1990 called Gender Trouble, and then she wrote another one called Bodies That Matter, and she's written many, many since. But those two books say that they argue. I mean, in some sense, of argue. That sex is a social construction. Biology itself, and in particular biological sex, is entirely socially constructed. There is no material reality underpinning it that we can really think about in any coherent sense. So all there is discursive, what she would call discursive kind of constructions of maleness and femaleness, masculinity, femininity, and on her view, gender, the way she uses it. I mean, this is before the idea of gender identity, right?
So she was way ahead of her time. I mean, this was this was 1990. Yeah,
1990. But gender is a performance, and that's sort of calcified over time through multiple instantiations. But like masculinity, so really what you might have thought of as masculinity and femininity as kind of social stuff underpinned by sex, she's kind of pulled off this trick where she's like, no, even the underpinning is social. There's just nothing that isn't social. And of course, if it's social, then it's contingent. It could be changed. It can vary from culture to culture. So she's opened up a conceptual space for people to say things like, the notion of biological sex is a white supremacist colonialist construction and things like this, which, if you've got any kind of allegiance to a scientific worldview, or one that's sort of amenable to the findings of science, those sorts of statements can boggle your mind. You just think, look, that sexual dimorphism is something that's found in many species, not just human ones, and how could it have been invented?
Well, seahorses, right? Aren't seahorses not dimorphic? So there, you can always play the seahorse card.
You can always talk about clownfish and seahorses, right. But again, it's a bit like, it's the rhetorical move of just pushing all these things together, and with enough smoke and mirrors, you will confuse everybody. And actually, it seems to work. So, fair play.
So, I mean, what would Judith Butler do with a story like poor David Reimer, who John Money's patient? I mean, he was raised as a girl, but he was still exhibiting all sorts of behaviors and instincts that were masculine.
One thing you can do is blame the context constantly and say that. So you can still do that now. You can pull that trick now. You can say that whatever the source of unhappiness, it's people's responses to the person that are somehow the problem rather than anything else. So I don't know. I just don't know what she'd say is the short answer.
Yeah. Or that
she
the
probably
parents
has written about it. I mean, I haven't tracked everything she's written.
Yeah. Or that the parents somehow knew. Yeah, sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, I think I mentioned that case in passing in my book because you're right. It raises a lot of interesting issues for contemporary times. But it's a really quite strange and relatively unique case. And I think I'm more interested in thinking about kind of the widespread, the structural, the sort of, if that sort of decision had been built into policy, then we would have, God knows where we'd be. But arguably, that's the sort of thing that is now being built into policy, and that's what really, really worries me.
Right. So to that end, the fifth moment is Julia Serrano says identity is the main thing that makes you a man or a woman. So let's just talk about that briefly in relation to the sixth moment, which is the Yogyakarta principles. That wasn't something I was familiar with. So that is something that is recommending recognition of gender as a human right. So talk about those ideas.
Sure. Well, I mean, Serrano wrote this book, Whipping Girl. Serrano's a trans woman and a biologist, I believe. So that comes with a certain amount of authority on both counts. And I think that book was pretty influential amongst thinking sort of, I don't know what you call thinking readers, but people who like to keep up with what's going on in culturally and has a gloss of science about it. So, it was on the cusp of the social wave that we're now really seeing, I think. And she argues that, well, she introduces the notion of cis. I don't know if she really came up with it, but certainly I think
who
she
did come up
popularized
with
it.
that? Who came up with cis?
I don't know. You keep asking me all these historians.
Sorry.
I'm a philosopher.
Okay, sorry. You could just make something up. You're a philosopher.
No,
just make something
exactly.
up.
That's what I do. But now I'm a bit worried. So no. I am not a historian, but I did get all that checked out with a historian before I published it. But yeah, I don't know who came up with this. I think what I would really like to see is some proper histories of all this stuff that aren't intensely.
Well, I think it's telling. I think it's telling that you don't know the answer because and that I don't know the answer because I'm not a philosopher, but I am interested in this stuff. And if I don't know and you don't know, I bet a lot of people don't know.
I think Serrano popularized the idea of cis or cissexual. And this is the idea that, so she has this argument that trans is just an adjective that you attach to woman or man, a bit like you might attach Asian or Catholic, so it's just trans women are a kind of woman. And the contrast class is cis women. So there's trans women and there's cis women, and together they comprise the class of women. Now, that's a surprising move if, like me, you'd always assumed that trans wasn't an adjective that you attached to women. Trans women was a different kind of thing to women. And that is what I used to assume, and it's what I still assume. So that's anathema to say in itself, but that is what I think. I think that there's women and then there's trans women, and those are different things. But the notion of cis really kind of helped normalize the idea, I think, that there's just two kinds of women: there's trans and there's cis. And the problem with that is if trans women are now identified in terms of, characterized it as such in terms of identity, and then you put that into public policy, so trans women are women, trans women is anyone who feels like a woman, and you put that into policy, then you get all the problems that we were just talking about, or many of the problems we were talking about.
Yeah. And so, just to quickly finish this list, though, then the invention of the concept of turf. No, not at all. I keep stopping you and asking you unanswerable questions. So number 7 is the invention of the concept of a TERF. A TERF is a trans exclusionary radical feminist. I'm sure you've been called that. I've probably been called it. If I had my Twitter notifications set differently, I would probably see more.
Don't do
more
that.
Of
I would advise against it.
Yes. But it's a horrible. It's a real slur. It's considered as such. So when did that arose? And then the last item on the list is the explosion of identities, which is what we've seen in the last couple of years. So all of these 8 moments really. I think it's a useful timeline, and it represents the sort of whole gestalt here. But yeah, how important is the rise of this TERF idea?
Well, it's a short way of saying something that's in itself, I think, misleading, because of course, if you're going to say that radical feminists or anyone who thinks that trans women and women are two different kinds of thing are exclusionary, then you've already kind of loaded the die against that view. So in itself, I think, I'm not trans exclusionary in any way. Any meaningful way. I absolutely think trans people have the right to every protection in terms of employment and in terms of healthcare and in terms of freedom from harassment and violence and so on. So to call me trans exclusionary, build that into a definition of what I am, I think is prejudicial. But then it gets shortened to TERF, and then it just becomes really easy to say to shout obscenities at me or and add turf, or it's a really ugly sound. And on the internet, on Twitter, if you Google the word turf, you will see its conjunction with all sorts of hideous threats.
Well, and people who are really do actual harm and violence to trans people, right? I mean,
amongst the turfs? Well, I mean, I don't think so.
We get lumped into that idea,
yes,
right?
Yes.
We're an enemy of trans people.
The people that tend to harm trans people, when you look at the circumstances of lamentable trans crimes, is usually males. It's not feminists sitting around reading radical feminist texts and then committing heinous violence. That's not how it goes. So it's really yes, it's an absolute sort of rhetorical move to kind of get women to be quiet, really, by calling us names and kind of implying that we must be evil bigots for having views that don't go along with what trans activism wants us to think.
We're going to pause here for a brief message.
Hi there. My name's Paul Shirley. I'm a former professional basketball player turned writer and also the founder of a thing called The Process. I'm honored to have a few seconds within Meghan's podcast to tell you what we do at The Process. If you're anything like most people, you're scattered, overstimulated, and frustrated by your inability to concentrate for long periods of time. Texts, emails, social media, and somehow you're expected to make progress at your job and on your passion projects. It's a lot. This is where The Process comes in. I believe that everything worth doing requires a process to do it, a set of habits and routines that allow you to access sustained periods of deep work. Through virtual co-working and productivity coaching, that's what we do at The Process. We help people like you learn to be productive, not busy. And here's the best part. You won't be doing this alone. Inside our platform, you'll meet people from all over the world, people who are dealing with the same frustrations you are, and people who want the same things you do: structure, accountability, community, and most of all, progress on the projects most important to you. We'd love to have you. To learn more, come see us at createyourprocess.com.
So your book is called Material Girls: Why Reality Matters for Feminism. And I was struck by the word reality in the subtitle because before you got involved in this, you wrote a lot about fiction and imagination. I wonder, what is is there a sort of overlap between this interest and some of your original academic pursuits?
There is. I mean, I think it's definitely part of the background that led me to this. I mean, so I spent a lot of my professional life thinking about fiction, how it works, what mental states it involves, both for, say, readers or people who are at a play and who are watching people move around on stage and imagining that they're somewhere else entirely. Also for actors themselves and what mental states they're having as they act. So there's also, fictions are a huge part of human life. When you think about how long we spend watching Netflix dramas or going to the movies or reading novels. And I think it's fascinating. So now what the connection is, this is my view, is that in fact, when we say trans women are women, we are immersing ourselves, both trans people and other people, in a benign, what we take to be a benign fiction. Now, I know that may sound difficult to hear for some people, but it is what I think. And actually, I think the reason we find it difficult to hear is because it's very difficult when you're immersed in a fiction to kind of reflect on the fact it's a fiction. It kind of breaks the fourth wall, as it were. Just for the same sort of reason as when we're at the theatre, we don't want people's mobile phones to go off. We just want to be immersed in this fiction. And as I talk about it, there's a whole chapter in the book about the role of fiction and how it can be a very positive force in people's lives. So I'm in no way saying it's something we shouldn't do in interpersonal contexts. It can be useful, and we do it in all sorts of different ways. And it's not the same as deceiving people or lying to them, or, so I make those distinctions very carefully and try to. However, there are also circumstances where being immersed in a fiction can be detrimental to yourself or to those around you. And the situation I'm particularly worried about is where institutions compel us to immerse ourselves in particular fictions. And I think those are really quite worrying, because at that point, people stop understanding it's a fiction and start taking it literally. And that can have all sorts of knock-on effects, say, for children's understanding of what's going on, or public understanding generally. So I try and detail that. So I think in a way that's partly what we're seeing with children and the rapid rise of gender identity disorders. Quite often it involves children who don't really understand what biology is and what its consequences are, and maybe what their bodies are doing, or they may feel very emotionally negative towards their bodies. And then a culture is now offering them a narrative saying, maybe you're a boy, maybe you're really a boy, you think you're a girl, but actually maybe you're really a boy. And they're taking that literally, and those around them are taking that literally. And I think, so we need to talk about how this fiction may have got out of control and what we can do about it.
Yeah. Why do you think it is? I mean, I don't want to take you out of your area of inquiry, but do you have theories as to why this is happening now? Why are we suddenly seeing like a 4,000% increase? I think I read that number somewhere. It might have come out of the UK of
5,000 in the UK.
5,000 in the UK.
In
okay.
Girls, yeah.
They don't. Well, there actually aren't numbers. I think the UK is the only statistics I've seen with real hard numbers have come out of the UK. It's very hard to track this, but we're seeing this increase, and there's all kinds of people running around, journalists and various kinds of cultural observers making sometimes insightful, other times glib assertions about why this is. What are your theories?
Well, I don't think there's a simple explanation. So I think it's going to be multifactorial in the sense of having lots of different causes coming together at one time. But one obvious culprit is the internet. So social media has allowed children to obviously communicate with each other and to be much more influenced than they would otherwise have been by social trends, because it's, the clue is in the name, social media, and we are very sociable animals as humans. We tend to just, adopt fashions or trends or ingest norms at the drop of a hat. So there is a correlation, I believe, between sites like Tumblr in the 2000s and 2010s and the rise of trans-identified children and teens. And I'm not the first person to say that by any means. But also, I think if you trace parallel discussions about the rise of self-harm in girls, so the name has gone out of my head, but that Netflix documentary that's on at the moment about the influence of social media.
Oh, The Social Dilemma?
Yes. So there's a graphic in the middle of that connects the rise in self-harm with the rise of smartphones in teenage girls, and also, I believe, suicide, although I'd have to go back and look. And it's really stark. So, I think girls are feeling worse and worse about themselves. This is a message that comes out of Abigail Schreier's book, Irreversible Damage, as well. Girls are feeling worse and worse about themselves by being exposed constantly to objectifying images, or images that show them what supposed perfection bodily and facially looks like for them. And then they are looking for narratives to express their distress. And that might be self-harm, it might be anorexia, or it might be breast binding and saying you're a boy. So we've got to look at that possibility properly. And the trouble is, it's become so politicized that as soon as someone suggests that, then trans activists try and shut it down. And I think that's really harmful for girls.
As you're speaking, I'm thinking about how there seems to be this connection between anime and young people who are identifying as transgender. Have you heard about this?
Well, I've
Like,
witnessed it in the sense
there's a
that I
lot of
can see a lot of avatars.
the avatars, yeah, but there is. So I had uh, a therapist on the show. One of the earliest episodes, actually, a therapist named Sasha Ayad
Oh yeah.
who works with young people announcing transgender identities, and she talked about how there just tends to be a lot of the kids. They seem to be interested in anime, and there's also a crossover with autism spectrum, and that somehow the aesthetic of anime, the very exaggerated facial expressions, the eyes that the large eyes, for instance, that this was somehow a comfort or an attraction to people who are on the spectrum. I mean, these are huge generalities, obviously, but this is just sort of
Sure.
one way of thinking about this. Maybe that people who have a hard time reading social cues might be inclined to appreciate this kind of aesthetic. But now I'm also thinking, like, you're talking about this sort of world, this kind of imaginative world, and the way that fiction kind
Mm.
of plays out. I'm just
Mhm.
totally thinking off the top of my head right now, so this might not make any sense. But what I wonder if there's a relationship between this kind of, surrealistic, like almost science, like fantasy fiction kind of genre um, type of sensibility, and how that might factor into any of this. I don't know. Just
I mean, I
whatever.
think what I would be willing to say is that kids and adults are spending more and more time, and this was before the pandemic, at home. They are actually physically disconnected from one another, but on computers, sort of virtually connected, inverted commas, to each other. But of course, in the virtual world, you can put forward you can curate, as the saying goes, your
Mm-hmm.
presentation. You can tell a totally new narrative about yourself that no one really can undermine, because they can't see you in real time. They can't track your bodily and facial movements. They can't hear your tone of voice or tell whether you're anxious or confident or cocky. They just, it's very flattening, the internet. It kind of makes everybody sound a bit the same, and everybody sounds quite confident, and so on. So, and or even when they're talking about their own anxieties, there's still a kind of confidence about it that it wouldn't be saying it necessarily out loud to a big crowd, but they can
Right.
say it on the internet. So you can really curate your own story, and there's a lot of affirmation from strangers very often, so you can become addicted to that. So I think it really allows you to get precisely immersed in a fiction about yourself if you go that way. Your point about autism is very well taken. So several studies and anecdotal evidence coming out of gender identity clinics in the UK suggest that quite a high proportion of trans-identified teens and children have autistic spectrum disorder, or on the autistic spectrum disorder. So, and that is important because they may well struggle with facial recognition. They may well struggle with conceptual categorization. It might take a bit longer for kids with some varieties of ASD. So those things are important when you're assessing what they're saying about themselves. They're building a complex net. We're all building complex networks of understanding about the world around us, and sometimes things can go awry in those stories that aren't immediately obvious. So I think we can't or we shouldn't ever just absolutely take people's stories about themselves at face value when the consequences are things like lifelong drugs. Of course, for most everyday situations, if somebody says, I'm this or I'm that, fine, whatever. You feel like that, that's great. But you've got to remember the context. We're talking about in many cases being put on a path that will end up with irreversible changes to sexual organs, to sexual function, maybe to bone density, to growth. There's lots and lots of big changes that will come if you are on a path to trans medicine. So I just think in those contexts, the discussion becomes a whole lot more important.
Well, and part of the fiction, as you might put it, is that if parents don't go along with this, the child will commit suicide.
Yes, and that's just not true. As a generalization, it's entirely politicized, and really shamefully politicized, so in the UK, we have organizations, there's one called Mermaids that claims to speak on behalf of trans-identified children, but constantly weaponizes the threat, as it were, of suicide in order to lobby for easier access to puberty blockers or lowering of the age at which you can get a gender recognition certificate. And the evidence is just not there. In fact, the National Health Service Gender Identity Clinic points out on its website that incidence of suicide amongst its patients is very low, but that you just would never get that impression from looking at the lobbyists' propaganda.
No. And like in terms of the parents and their reactions, I mean, I don't know. I'm struck often. I mean, I see this in people I know. I know so many people who are parents and their kids have come to them and said, I'm transgender. Like at least 5 or 6 fairly good friends of mine, and it comes and goes. Maybe it doesn't last that long. Maybe it goes on for a period of years. There's such pressure that these parents feel to go along with it for fear that not doing so will cause real harm. But I mean, in some cases, and I'm not talking about anyone I know specifically, but just I see it on social media. I just see it like it's almost like the parents become part of the story. It's almost like they are excited about it. I mean, they want their child to thrive. They have the best interests of their kids at heart. Let's be clear about that. But there is something kind of strange happening with this sort of whole the celebratory aspect of it. What do you make of that? And I don't mean I hesitate to this sounds like I'm being disparaging. I'm not. This is
No,
really a
it's
dispassionate
just
observation.
sure. I think it's I know what you mean for certain parents, but I do think it's incredibly difficult um, to stand against a social deluge, as it were, especially in certain subcultures. So I'm sure there are some subcultures in the States, there are in the UK, where this is not a common, trans-identified children is not a common phenomenon. And then there's other subcultures like academic subcultures, maybe university campuses or whatever, where it's very common because it partly depends on things like class. that,
Yeah, well,
also
these are
don't get mentioned about.
the liberal, yes,
Yeah,
the
it's a less
Chardonnay
liberal
drinking,
thing.
yes,
Yeah,
yes,
exactly. And so that in itself should tell you something about its social origins.
yeah,
But there's always been children who identify strongly with the opposite sex. I mean, especially once you meet loads of lesbians, as I'm sure loads and loads of lesbians have histories of saying they were boys as children. And
right.
I've got a friend, actually she's not a lesbian, but she used to want to pee. Well, she used to pee standing up. She used to try, and she absolutely didn't want to sit down.
Wow.
And I've got several close friends who were called boys' names by by choice. Their parents went along with it. But their parents didn't tell them they were boys. They just said, yeah, if you want to be called George, right, you're George. Yeah, if you want to wear that, you can wear that. So they let them go through what they were going through. But that's different, I think, to what's happening now because precisely of the surrounding kind of structures through educational context, through academic context, which are all saying, no, if they feel they're a boy, they really are a boy. And that's completely different. So standing up against that is hard, I think. Nonetheless, I think you should really try. I think you should
Yeah.
try and create a space for your child to be who they want to be in a kind of benign sense rather than a very loaded sense. Just let them go through experimentation without consequences, I think.
Well, also, and just broadening the definition of maleness or femaleness. I mean, I'm sure some of my listeners are rolling their eyes right now because I tend to bring this up a lot, but I like we're around the same age. I grew up in the 70s and the 80s. And at that time, if you were a girl, there were a lot of ways you could be. You could be, they called us tomboys. Like you could be into sports. You could be like a girly girl. There were a lot of ways of presenting. In fact, there was much more freedom in female presentation than in male presentation in
Yeah,
a lot
that's
of
true.
ways. And I think something did change. Maybe starting in the 90s or the early aughts, we had this kind of hyper feminization in the culture. There was the Disney princess phenomenon, and then this kind of online pornography came around, and there was this kind of raunch culture. So I do think that it's harder to be a girl
Yes. Oh,
now
yeah.
than it used to be. Sorry,
Oh,
it's
God, yeah.
pretty simple.
I couldn't agree more. I mean, I think it's horrific, to be honest, what girls face as soon as they reach puberty in terms of social media and the pressure, extra pressures upon them. And as you just mentioned, porn, which is another thing, another elephant in the room that really needs to be thought about in conjunction with women's experience. If you're constantly confronted with images of women being brutalized, sexually, or even just objectified generally, kind of MTV style objectification.
Yeah, and impossible standards. I mean,
Impossible
Instagram filters
standards.
on everything. We didn't
Impossible
have that.
standards, but also, highly sexualized culture where things like choking and spitting are, becoming more and more normalized as part of a sex act. I don't blame people for thinking this is not for me. I need to get out of this. I need to press an escape button. I absolutely don't blame anyone for this. It's not the point. The point is to look at the structural background to it and how these things are interacting to produce the phenomenon we see. So, yeah.
What was your relationship to femaleness growing up? Did you ever question
Yeah.
your gender?
Well, not in those terms. And I certainly wasn't a tomboy physically. Like anyone who knew me then would laugh at the idea that I was a tomboy physically because I was absolutely rubbish at sports. But I definitely know what it is to feel uncomfortable with my female body. Absolutely know that. And I think coming out, realizing I was gay, just getting all that sort of my head, which took me ages, took me years, has really. I've got a narrative now which puts me more on the sort of masculine identified side than the feminine, undoubtedly. That's got nothing to do with the way my body presents. Obviously, I'm absolutely feminine in presentation, biological presentation, as it were. So yeah, I although I never really talk about it because for a start, I think it'll just be ridiculed. I'm fully aware of, why you might have strong feelings around your sex, and they might be negative feelings. I'm very aware of that.
Do you think that your willingness to speak out and take some hits and be controversial is a masculine trait?
Well, no, I don't know. No, I mean, we're talking about these things as social, aren't we? So socially, yes, in the sense that it's for most cultures, if you had to make a choice between, if you had to say what is, I don't know how we'd characterize what I've been doing, but like women are characterized as more kind of socially conforming, aren't they? I think,
Yeah, or
according to
compliant,
standard
or
perceptions. Yeah,
what are the five traits? One of them is it's not compliance, but agreeableness.
agreeableness. Yeah, well, I'm not. I haven't been that agreeable lately, and I'm less and less inclined actually
Well,
to be
because
agreeable.
you write in the introduction, I definitely count as a heretic, and
Yeah.
that suits me fine. I didn't become a professional philosopher to go to church, and
Well, yeah.
I
I mean,
thought
I
that's
think
great.
I'm just very annoyed at my profession, to be honest. Although there are lots of honourable exceptions, but I went into philosophy thinking that here was an arena where we could slug it out conversationally, and I know philosophers who will argue with me about literally anything. I used to be Facebook friends with lots of philosophers, not so much anymore, but I used to be friends with them, and I'd see them arguing about tiny, tiny matters that no one gives a toss about out in the world. And then this comes along, this big issue about identity and politics and policies and, and they suddenly just go deathly quiet. And I just thought, oh my God, what were you doing it for? This is our time. This is our moment. And they've just faded away. Some of them, not all of them, but.
And why is that? Because I feel this way about a number of different issues that are kind of flying around right now. It's like, this is so interesting. I keep saying to people, like, this is the best show in town talking about this stuff. Why are you ducking it? Is it because they're just sheep? Like they're frightened and they don't want people to be mad at them? Like, or they don't want a certain kind of person to be mad at them?
I think a lot of them are frightened. Depends on which day you're talking to me. If I was to be maximally charitable, which I suppose I should try, it's true that in the UK at the moment, there's huge potential professional consequences to saying what I'm saying. So I've actually, I've suffered, well, anyway, people are worried about their jobs. I'm not worried about my job at the moment, but I have been worried about various professional censure as I proceeded. So it's reasonable to worry about your job, and especially if you're not tenured or you've got promotion ahead of you or whatever. But at the top level, the professors, I really don't know what their excuse is, to be honest.
Yeah, that's what I don't understand. People who have tenure. I mean, I had a guest a few weeks ago who is the chair of this new organization called the Academic Freedom Association. I believe that's what it is, Academic Freedom Foundation. And it's like, apparently even tenured professors are afraid of the consequences. Yeah. And I thought that was the whole tenure.
Yeah. And if you look at the statutes of UK universities, it says things like you should have, it's part of the object of universities to test controversial opinions. But
right.
I guess
what are you doing here? Yeah.
They are more sheep-like than I realized. Some people, I had not realized how sheep-like they are. I guess also people, there's a lot of, as we saw in the beginning, there's a lot of complexity, or at least complication around the ideas of gender. The terminology is quite complicated. Then you think, oh, do I have to know about intersex? That's really complicated. And I guess you might just think, oh, I just don't understand this stuff and I don't want to say the wrong thing. But
it's like you got a PhD. You're going to say, I don't want to understand it. It's too complicated.
It's also affecting a large number of people, because the lie of the activists is that this is just about trans people. But of course, they're changing policies which are changing the definition of woman. Then that's 51% of the population. So it's kind of important.
What have been the consequences for you? Are you shunned on campus? Do you have students who are like afraid to take your class, or who want to take it but don't want to be seen taking it? Like, what's your relationship to other faculty and to students? Actually, I'm really interested in that.
Well, I never see the ones that don't want to take my classes, obviously. So I don't have a complete overview because they wouldn't go anywhere near me. And I'm sure there are some like that. But I have to say, on the whole, my relationships with students have stayed what they always were, which is good. And I think the idea, the sort of paranoid worry about the snowflake on campus is not right. It's on campus, as probably everywhere else, like the majority of people are open-minded, and they might not agree with me, but they're not going to try and get me sacked at all. However, there are a small bunch of ideologues or zealots or whatever you want to call them, people who are really, really angry with me, both in the student population and in faculty, and they speak very loudly, and they will go and complain about me, put me through official complaints procedures, write to my bosses and so on. So they will be active, and in a way they have a chilling effect on the rest, because people get intimidated around them, so then they don't want to say, hang on a minute, are you sure it's a bit more complicated than that or something, so I think this is the structure that we're seeing in all over the place, not just campuses, in organizations generally, that there's a small bunch of very vocal activist style people who really think that they're doing the work of social justice by trying to get me fired, for instance. And then there's a whole other bunch that probably disagree but are intimidated by them.
What kinds of classes do you teach? Do they all have to do with this? I mean,
No. Only. Well,
uh,
actually, at the moment, I teach feminist philosophy. So, and I have one class within that on this, but most of the time I'm just talking about like classic issues from radical and liberal feminism. And then I also teach at the moment ethics, and that's kind of metaphysics of ethics. And I teach aesthetics, and I teach a course called Language, Truth and Literature. So yeah, I'm teaching in quite a wide range of things, and thankfully a lot of it is relatively apolitical, which is quite nice for me.
They don't notice any of that. So what's been your involvement in terms of policy? I think, did you speak to the House of Lords, or have you become a sort of
Sure.
political figure?
Yeah,
Or
I guess I have.
activist?
So I did an event at the House of Lords a few years ago. Most recently, I gave oral evidence to a parliamentary committee who are doing yet another public consultation on gender recognition reform. And I was pleased to be invited to give some evidence there. And I've written various witness statements for judicial reviews. So I'm also got an interest because of this on free speech or academic freedom. So that's free speech within universities, because we have this, I think, really non-optimal situation in UK universities where trans activist organisations are deeply embedded in UK universities. And this just turns universities into kind of trans activist organisations, and it makes it so much harder for me and people who have my views to say what we think. And I want to stress as well that this is not, I think that's bad. It's obviously bad for me, but the real bad aspect is that we're just not getting good academic data about all the things that we've been talking about. That's the problem, that we don't know enough about the effects of puberty blockers on children, or what's going on in single-sex spaces, or what will happen if people can self-identify their way into single-sex schools or sports or whatever. So that's the problem, that there's a knowledge gap because people like me are being intimidated into silence. Well, I'm not, but other people are.
Have you had any involvement in the stuff going on at the Tavistock clinic? That this is the gender clinic in London that was recently.
Sure.
There was a lawsuit. A number of young people who are now detransitioners were suing or at least one.
Well,
sued the clinic. One,
yeah, it's called a judicial review, so it's not exactly suing, but anyway, it doesn't matter. The point is that this very brave detransitioner called Kira Bell took a judicial review out against the NHS Tavistock Gender Identity Service. So, and it's about their use of puberty blockers. So no, I haven't had anything to do with that. Although I have met Kira Bell once, which I was proud to do. I think what's amazing about the UK is we've got all this situation, and the fact that gender identity theory is so prevalent over here and so kind of unquestioned by national institutions who've just kind of taken it wholesale from lobbying organisations. This has caused a backlash where grassroots feminist organisations are coming up, some of them representing the interests of children, some of them representing the interests of women athletes, some of them representing working class women, and just kind of saying, no, we need to be in on these conversations. So Kira was backed by this amazing organisation called Transgender Trend. And if your listeners are interested, you can look them up. They've got a huge amount of resources about gender identity ideology in schools and how to how to support gender non-conforming children, children with gender identity disorders. It's all written from a really sensible, evidence-based perspective. They're commonly, if you look them up again, you'll find people saying they're a hate group. They are not a hate group in any way. They are advocating.
It doesn't take much to be a hate group.
It really
these
doesn't.
days.
They advocate for watchful waiting for children with gender identity disorders, and I think that's the most sensible path by far.
Yeah. I'm going to wrap up in a few minutes here, but actually just it occurs to me, I feel like I would be kicking myself if I didn't take this opportunity to ask you, what do you think of J.K. Rowling? What is she doing? What did she ever say? Because I feel like I've been following like 80% of it, but how do you feel about her as a voice in all of this?
I think she's amazing, and I feel I take sort of some kind of vicarious pride in her first intervention, or one of her main, sort of the one everyone knows about, because there's this case. The context was a legal case in the UK involving a woman called Maya Forstater, who had made various tweets that said things like, oh gosh, I'm going to get it wrong now, but basically that people can't change sex. She thinks, people can't change sex, and she was tweeting from a kind of gender critical perspective, but
and she was fired, right?
Her contract was terminated, so she took her employers to an employment tribunal, and she lost. And the judge said that this belief that she had, that people cannot change sex, I'd have to go and look at the details again, but people cannot change sex, something like that, was not worthy of respect in a democratic society. So I wrote a blog post, furious, and I wrote the blog post was called "This is not a drill." And then J.K. Rowling must have read it. But anyway, she tweeted her famous tweet and wrote "#This is not a drill." So I was like, oh, amazing. That connection really makes me very proud. But the general point is she sees what I think are the problems, and I think she sees them in a very clear-eyed way. And she must have known she'd get a backlash. She must have known she would, and she did it anyway. And she hasn't wavered. So I think she's compassionate. She's coming from a very good place. So even if you think she's wrong about it, you cannot deny her good intentions, her warmth, and her desire to do the right thing by young adults. So from all those perspectives, I think she's impeccable, and I happen to agree with her as well. So I think she's brilliant.
Okay, thank you for articulating that so concisely. So just the last chapter of the book is called "A Better Activism in the Future." You explain how there is this binary, so to speak, within women reacting to the trans movement. There are the radical feminists, the gender critical feminists, versus the trans activists and what you call the third wave feminists. What would you like to see happen, both in philosophy on a theoretical level and just on a practical level? Like, how the prison question seems particularly difficult to resolve. That I don't like.
Yeah.
Are we supposed to just build prisons for trans people? Are we supposed to have sports teams for trans people? It's really hard. It's really
it's hard,
thorny.
but it's not impossible. And in fact, there's in the UK there is now a wing of a prison for trans people. So that is for obviously trans people convicted of crimes and sent to prison are sent to this wing. Although there are also still, I believe, males in the female prison system in the UK. But generally speaking, I think that's the approach that should be taken. It shouldn't be the default assumption should not be, either this person goes into the male space or they go into the female space, and those are the only two options. There is a possibility in many contexts of having a third option. Now, as I think there's not going to be a one solution fits all for every problem, but for sports, for instance, that whole problem is being presented very tendentiously as the idea that trans people do not have a right to compete in sporting competition. Well, of course they do. They could compete in the sporting category reserved for their sex, and actually some trans people do. So I don't think, and they do happily. So there are trans women competing in male football teams, for instance. So
trans women, and the male football teams are welcoming them.
Yes, I mean, like, so I'm not saying that's going to work everywhere. I'm not saying that alternatives shouldn't be explored, but we don't just have one solution for every kind of problem here. I think what we do need to get away from is the idea that the only possible solution for all of this is that women should budge up, make room, sacrifice their own interests and shut up, which seems to be the way it's being presented at the moment. Now, clearly that is not sustainable. So there has to be communication. It has to be evidence-based. We have to have academics precisely looking into the likely scenarios, not from a politicized activist perspective, but from a kind of more sober, evidence-based, more neutral perspective, and really work out together in conjunction with trans people what's in their interest. Another thing to add here, I think, which I'd really like to mention, is that many, many trans people are very unhappy with the way trans activist organizations represent their interests.
Yes, that's huge.
So we should not take it as read that when, the ACLU or GLAAD find, present their favored version of events for trans people, their favored policy, that was produced by consensus with the trans community. The trans community is diverse, is politically diverse, and geographically diverse, and there's a huge age range. So, and it also encompasses this split we mentioned before between transsexuals who have had major significant surgery over the course of a long time, and hormones over a long time, and people who haven't made any bodily changes and have a non-standard gender identity. So, of course, they're going to have different answers for certain questions. And so that's another area academia needs to get in and properly find out, like, what trans people think.
Yeah. Why aren't there more trans people who are not the radical trans activists that we hear most often from? Are they just not stepping up? Are they being silenced? Like, where are they?
Well, I think also one thing we do have to remember is that if you are a transsexual and you've lived happily sort of under the radar in your community for years, it's difficult to have a conversation with people. You may not have even disclosed that you're transsexual. So they didn't, many transsexuals, I get letters from transsexuals saying, I don't want to be a political activist. I don't want to have to come out and make demands on behalf of the trans community. But of course, this leaves a vacuum where other people will fill that gap, and they may have very different views to you. So I don't know. I mean, we've got technology. There's got to be ways to do interviews, to do studies with large numbers of people where the proper kind of academic standards are maintained, and it's not a political exercise to come up with an answer that's identified in advance. That's the sort of thing I'm talking about. We don't necessarily need new trans activists, I don't think, but we do need a better understanding of trans people's needs that doesn't just come from a few voices.
Well, Kathleen, thank you so much for speaking with me. This has been a really, really illuminating and accessible conversation.
I hope so. Thank you.
Thanks for everything you've done and are doing, and good luck going forward.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Same to you.
That was my interview with Kathleen Stock. She is a professor of philosophy at the University of Sussex in England. Her book, Material Girls: Why Reality Matters for Feminism, was published by Little Brown last week in the UK and is available everywhere on Kindle. The US edition of the book will be published on September 21st. You've been listening to the Unspeakable Podcast. If you'd like ad-free editions of this podcast, please support it at any level on the Patreon page. That's patreon.com/theunspeakable. There, you can get lots of perks, including, if you join at the $10 a month level or higher, $10 off your first purchase of official Unspeakable Podcast Nuanced AF merchandise. You can find the items in the Nuance store on the show's website, theunspeakablepodcast.com. I'll be back next week with another super nuanced guest. Until then, thanks for listening. See you next time.
Hi, I'm Frank. I don't like change. And I just saw a billboard for this new BJ's Wholesale Club talking about how you could pay as little as 2 cents a gallon for gas. Look, when gas prices are this low, we can't complain about gas prices being too high. No, sir. I wouldn't join BJ's Wholesale Club.
Hey, thanks, Frank. But if you do want to sign up now to get a $40 BJ's digital gift card, join the new BJ's Wholesale Club, opening soon in Ross Township. Visit bjs.com/Ross Township or the BJ's Membership Center at the Block Northway. Offer valid for a limited time.
Addiction is a disease that impacts all of us. Whether you, your neighbor, friend, or family member is struggling, everyone feels the pain of addiction. Recovery Centers of America, Monroeville, wants you to know that addiction treatment works and recovery is possible. Call 1-888-RECOVERY now for help for yourself or a loved one. Recovery Centers of America have helped thousands of patients across the United States and here in Western Pennsylvania start a better, healthier way of life through their evidence-based inpatient and outpatient treatment programs. The caring team of physicians and clinicians at Recovery Centers of America see their patients as so much more than their addiction and are deeply committed to providing expert care with heart. Recovery Centers of America knows that every day in active addiction is a day in isolation, which is why they admit new patients 24/7 year-round. Don't wait. Make the call that can change everything. Call 1-888-RECOVERY now.